This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Permian Basin Oil and Gas Magazine, delivering trusted oil and gas news and industry insight. We appreciate their support of real conversations like the one you're about to hear. Subscribe today at pbog.com. Good afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. We got a very interesting topic to discuss. With $100 prices out in the Permian and in the oil industry and oil patch, you would think things are going swimmingly. But there's a lot of challenges to make sure that we can continue to produce at the levels that America needs us to do. Today, we've got a fantastic speaker that really is well in tune with all of these issues and challenges. Michael Lozano is with Permian Basin Petroleum Association. He is over the government affairs and communications. But if you look in his background, it's so perfect for not only his role at PBPA, but also for this conversation. He has graduated from University of Texas in Austin, has a wealth of experience within the governmental affairs side, serving as chief of staff for a state rep, served as on the staff of two Odessa state reps. When he was working at the House, was involved and covered 14 different standing and special committees. So I would say he really understands what's going on in government, but also in the oil industry in particular. So when we look at the challenges, there's several buckets, but we're going to try to limit it to a few of them. We're going to talk about electricity. We're going to talk about water. We're going to talk about leasing and land issues. And then kind of a unique thing that he's been working on is oilfield theft. We're seeing a huge escalation of that. So with this, Michael, tell us, how do we, as Permian producers, or really a lot of this is going to be affecting Texas as a whole, but since you're with Permian Basin Petroleum Association, how do the producers deal with all of these? It's almost like a whack-a-mole, that there's always an issue out there. What are they? How do we deal with that?
That's kind of the $1 million challenge, I think, for all of our members. And thank you, Grant, for having us. Really appreciate the working with you and all the work that OTE does to highlight issues that are important to the industry. There's no question. There's no shortage of them, right? I think, like we were saying earlier, these challenges find us. We don't look for them. And I think if you look at operators today, we probably spend less time talking about the basic nuts and bolts of operations. We spend a lot less time talking about, drilling and completions. We talk a lot more about air, a lot more about water, a lot more about electricity, a lot more about all these other ancillary issues that are now driving factors for operators and real concerns. And, I think if you were to ask me in 2009, when I first got involved in the legislature, when I was still in school, what would be the number one issue, I would have said the challenge is continuing to produce with the rock, right? I mean, we were starting to see fracturing start to begin and take off,
Right.
but that was still a novel concept. Now that's a manufacturing process effectively. That's the simplest part of our conversations,
Really
right?
has become that.
Isn't that insane to think about that? I mean, the idea in the industry that there would be no more dry holes. I mean, we take that for far too granted right now, I think. But now we have other challenges. And I think, one of those, for example, is electricity. That's an easy one to start off with. And I say it's easy because it's probably, no pun intended, the most politically charged issue right now. But one thing we do know that are facts that everyone agrees on, everyone agrees with. We know that the load growth in the Permian Basin has been dramatically increased, right? And unfortunately, operators for the better part of the decade and a half have not been able to rely on regulated industries to catch up. And so our members probably own the largest fleet of on-site generation in the Western world, probably in the total, in all of the world, probably. I know one operator that had probably 300,000 barrels of production a couple years ago, and they probably had about 200 on-site generation units. That's just in the Permian alone.
Yep.
And that's a huge amount of infrastructure to take care of, right? And
Well, it's
obviously,
a huge amount of cost.
Huge
If
cost.
you're worried about environmental, those natural gas gensets definitely produce that. Reliability.
It's huge reliability.
There's a whole lot of things that fit into it that could be negative, that could be addressed by electrical
By
infrastructure.
interconnection, yeah. And I think the irony is when some of these data centers first started getting stood up and said, how did y'all do this with this islanding concept? The first thought I had was, well, we didn't want to. You have to understand, y'all are building your model on a model we don't want to operate in. We want to move these generators off location as soon as we can because of cost, because of reliability. And if you talk to some operators, for example, after Winter Storm Uri, one of the hardest things was to go get those generators kicked back up after, them being shut off remotely or because of fuel constraints,
Right.
at 130 different locations, all spread out through West Texas, from whether it's Big Spring to Monahans, or even worse, Pecos, right? That's a hard job to do on icy roads. And so reliability is at the very least the biggest concern from those sets. And, part of the problem is that the industry is not well understood by the electrical community, right? I mean, I think, from a simple perspective, right, oil and gas has never been really regulated by the PUC, has never really had communications with ERCOT about what this stuff happened. Uri really, I think, was a watershed moment, opening everyone's eyes about how interconnected this supply chain really is. And from our perspective, some things as simple as vernacular was a challenge. I heard from folks at PUC and ERCOT during Uri, saying, we have a problem with natural gas producers. And I'm like, okay, who in your mind, who is that? Because in my mind, I'm thinking at the wellhead. I'm an upstream E&P kind of guy. And so that's really our perspective. And then I hear from them, they're talking about large natural gas producers that are selling directly to generators. I would never call those a producer, just from a vernacular perspective, right? So we had to level set to figure out who's on first, what's really going on here. And that was eye-opening, truly.
Well, the government passed the Permian Basin
Yeah.
Reliability Plan.
Mhm.
Explain what that is, and then I think that dovetails in with the 765 kilovolt plan, which could have huge effect, but it's also fairly controversial.
It has become controversial, and I think that's an unfortunate reality of challenge, right? So when I first joined PBPA, Ben Shepard, the president of our association, and the electrical folks, working in conjunction with Encore and TNMP and PUC and ERCOT to some extent, have been trying to explain how important it is to electrify these assets. For a large part, it's cost too. I mean, the number I hear right now is it's 3 to 5 times capital expenditure to build these gen sets than it is to just interconnect. The problem is, even in 2018, the delays were probably conservatively 12 months to 18 months. Now we're hearing 36, right? And
There's a lot of people that want that type of equipment.
100%.
Puts a lot of pressure.
And just even to interconnect with Encore. I mean, we're hearing, the challenges are delays to interconnection, right? That and the greatest irony is not only is it a delay, when you get to the point where they say that there's no delay, you end up with a circumstance where you're having half of the power that you still need. Right. And we're entering a place of generic transmission constraints that have been around since at least 2020. What we're trying to do is build infrastructure for the Permian Basin that's effectively what we needed a decade ago. And we're hoping to have it by 2030, which isn't great. So I think, while there are some controversies about 75 kV lines and other things like that, the reality is everyone agrees we need the power.
Explain what those 765 kV lines are all about.
Yeah, so effectively, the Permian Basin Reliability Plan did two things. It approved the local projects to help interconnections at the local level. I think the last time a 345 kilovolt line in the Permian Basin was built was, I think, 2011. And so that means it was probably approved in 2007, right? Because these things take 3 to 5 years to build.
You bet.
And so, and we're talking about large lines. We're talking about big projects in the tens of billions of dollars. There's no cheap. One of the things I saw is there's a 20-mile project, and I saw the price tag at $300 million. And there's no cheap projects in this space. They're expensive. They take a long time. There's a lot of permitting cost to it, not to mention material cost. I mean, these are imported assets that come up from overseas, not to mention high cost for copper and all these other materials that are just inflation is certainly causing some price spikes for those things. And everyone's trying to buy these things. Everyone, whether it's SPP, ERCOT, MISO, operators. At one point I had an operator tell me that a TSP, a transmission service provider, approached them and asked them if they could buy some transformers from them because they had delays that they didn't expect. And they said, well, no, we're deploying those for our local distribution next week. We can't do that. And so, long story short, everyone's competing in this space. But the reliability plan did two things. It built these local projects to help firm up local infrastructure. And then the only way to energize those projects is to build power lines that move large, gridded power around. Now, and that's the way it currently is now. The controversy that seems to be in question is, why not build local generation? That's a very good question. The answer shortly and succincly is the state doesn't mandate generation. The market does, right? And right now, there's not an economic method to build a natural gas generator or generation units in West Texas. Even with a $10 billion Texas Energy Fund, we've only seen one project approved in West Texas. There were 6 that tried to apply, but some pulled out because of deadlines and issues. But in totality, I think what the short answer is the market itself to build thermal generation is not a robust one that is a lot of folks are seeking incentive to build, right? And that's a challenge that we obviously want to engage on.
I know you have all this gas, and a lot of the gas that is being sold for negative amounts. It seems like such a natural fit, but it does take $1 billion
Well,
or more, whatever, to
exactly.
build that. So who's going to ante up that?
And there's absolutely truth to the problem that the distorted market functions that exist are because of renewables, right? There's no question. They have a break-even price that's negative. That is, even with negative gas,
Yep.
that's still not something you can compete with, especially given that the way the market works day of is these plants are coming on and off. So effectively, these large, very expensive gas plants would be basically peaker plants. And so you'd have gold-plated peaker plants that would run maybe a couple hours a day, and there's no way to
It's
make your
not the
return
most
back.
efficient. Yeah.
It isn't. And I'd love to figure out how to fix that. And for the life of me, I think everyone that's working in this space wants to fix that too. The problem is, can we fix that faster than we could build these import paths? Probably not. And this is not to say that people are wrong because they disagree. I want to know they're very smart people that disagree or agree with us. That doesn't mean they're right or wrong. These are policy decisions that are, none of us want to be in the middle of this. I think the only thing that happens when you're in the middle of a fight is you get shot at, right? And
Right.
you're just guaranteed to get hit. And I don't think we want to do that. I know we don't, but I think we have to be intellectually honest and look at what options we actually have. And unfortunately, I don't see a bevy of options, right? This is highlighted by the fact that even with a $10 billion fund the state created,
Right.
with basically as a no interest loan effectively for the construction of these projects, they could be sited anywhere, and they could have contracts to help guarantee their economics. And natural gas being as cheap as it is, and frankly, potentially using a feedstock of treated produced water, which could be pretty close to free too.
Right.
All of these things still don't make it economic. And I think that's how do we address that question
Yep.
is one I think we're all trying to figure out.
And you've specifically talked about gensets and how producers could use that, but just in general, and this dovetails with that, the need for electricity in the Permian is like over the next 15, 20 years is like 4 times the amount that
100%.
they have. So do you any sense as to what this 765 kV project can bring in? What does that solve it, or is that
It's a
just a
start.
step?
I think, frankly, we probably need both. That's the irony of the situation. We probably need localized generation, and we need these imports. And the thing about any circuit, I'm not an electrical engineer. Don't quote me on the technicalities of these things. But I think at the very basic level, even though I did attend Texas that you don't love, Grant,
Oh, no.
I know how a circuit works, right? And at
There
the
you
very
go.
basic foundation of it, the thing about power is it moves around, and I could foresee a future where local generation comes online because of the import pass if they get built, and they could become exports. Like that's kind of the beauty of a circuit, right? Is it moves it around, and the beauty of the grid is it is effectively created to move power where it is needed when it is needed, and at 765 it is the most efficient we have in the Western world that we know at this that they're under construction currently, and so or that exists currently. And I think just to give you a kind of a perspective, right? When we first started talking about this in the Permian, right now there's about 7 gigs of power out in West Texas and in the
Okay.
ERCOT grid, right? So the ERCOT grid doesn't cover most of the Panhandle, but it covers from like south of Gaines County to El Paso, and then all the way to East Texas, except for a couple counties there. So I think there's maybe 20 counties in the state that are not covered in the ERCOT market, which does make it functionally significantly easier to manage than MISO or SPP. Now, we represent operators in New Mexico too, so we've gotten our taste of the Southwest Power Pool, and I understand why people like ERCOT more. I'll leave it there at that. But
Okay.
but if you look at the market as a whole, there's 7 gigs of gridded activity in the Permian right now. We estimate conservatively there's probably 5 gigs behind the meter that operators are currently generating for their assets today. That's more than the city of Houston uses daily, right? So when you look at it's almost a tale of two worlds here. One is the gridded activity, and one is the off-grid activity that's behind the
Right.
meter that is very costly, very competitive. And so the imports would effectively seek to accommodate 17 gigs of power, which frankly we probably think would be what we need, especially given how much more power is needed for water treatment and for moving it around, right? I mean,
Throw in
that's
data
so,
centers,
and yeah, data
all
centers
that other.
notwithstanding, I
Yeah.
think there's no question the demand for oil and gas
We'll
is
just
there.
grow. Yeah.
And that's the sad part too, is all of these decisions that we're making, we're trying to make for 5 years in advance, right? We're talking about when this was approved in 23, the whole point was looking at 2030. Now it's 2026, and
4
we
years
still don't
away
have
and
steel in the
still don't.
ground, and that's a challenge, right?
And you got various challenges. You got right of way
Sure,
issues. You
yeah.
got there's a lot of
Supply
pushback
supply
from
chain
in
is
supply
truly,
chain
you
and
know,
cost. Yeah.
cost. And that's the other part of this is, we're probably, unfortunately, like everything in public policy, we've tried, like, roads are a great example of this. I remember white knuckling from Garden City to Midland for
Sure.
years, from like 2010, 11, 12. And in 2013, the state finally approved statewide Proposition 1, which helped build roadway infrastructure. And we're now seeing the fruits of that today. That was 13 years ago. I mean, it takes time to build this infrastructure, and unfortunately it takes time to get buy-in from everyone to do that. So in the decade it took to agree that we needed infrastructure, and then the decade it took to put it in place, now we're seeing that benefit. It's the state. I think, Tryon Lewis, one of my first bosses in West Texas, great state representative, former district judge out of Odessa, was a state district judge for 21 years, chaired judiciary in the House, was then on the TxDOT commission as the chair. Taught me something I think that is very true. The legislature is long on talent, but it is sometimes short on vision. And what he means by that is communities do send the best of their communities to represent their interests at the state level. But sometimes you get here and it is hard to see the forest from the trees because you're in the middle of it. And that's hard to do. It's not a
Well, I think
knock.
politics also forces you to deal with the next 12 months,
Correct.
not the next 20 years.
And that's hard, right? Especially when you look at a public policy issue that you have to be far more thoughtful about it. And, maybe there's some truth to the political challenges of our day being daily news, being much more compressed to hourly, right? A tweet can change the world kind of a thing. And it's no longer, or an X, I don't know what we're calling those. But those things can change the world on a dime versus, you had your daily paper, maybe a weekly in some parts of rural Texas. Maybe that bought a little more time. Now it's, if you're not engaging directly all the time, people don't think you're around. And that's a hard thing for any elected official to deal with.
Well, let's move to another topic that will probably, however complicated you think electricity is, I think could actually make it this could even be more complicated. And that's the issue of water, produced water. And your point about not thinking 20 years out reminds me of a conversation or a presentation that I heard from Senator Charles Perry,
Yeah.
talking about water and how the lack of vision and setting water infrastructure up is really going to get us, because I guess there's like 16 stations and 13 of them think they'll be out of water within 20 years.
And certainly you have cities like Corpus, right, that are seeing it
Oh,
now. I mean,
yeah.
there's no question. There's the old, is it Whitman line? I can't remember who said it. Maybe was it Mark Twain? But water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. There's a truth to some of this in the Permian that we have all of this water right now. We're probably disposing about 20 million barrels a day of water. To say that's a lot is an understatement,
And
right?
you always think, and he said it, and I've always thought that if you could find a way to clean that, you'd have the most agriculture rich area of West Texas. So how is this going to affect the industry, oil and gas industry in the Permian and the southeast New Mexico? What can be done?
So I think complicated problems are often easily simplified by what I think are simple truths. And the reality is this: we know the technology is there. We know that the industry can clean this water to any sort of spec required, right? Whether that's for land application or discharge into the Pecos, or whether that's, the irony is in some of the cases, in most of these cases, you'll basically treat the water to a potability standard, and then you have to resalinate it because it's too clean, right? You can't put that on. You would wash out every native plant in West Texas if you put a land application of potable water, right? That's kind of just what happens. And so, ironically, the water being treated is going to be cleaner than municipal water standards, and it's going to have to be, dirtied up a little bit to be used in what constituents it's needed.
Where do we stand on getting those standards? Because
So-
it does seem everyone's fearful because of the liability of putting that water into a river or into the ground.
Yeah, so right now, my understanding is that two permits have been returned to operators just this week,
Okay.
if not maybe Friday, but officially I think maybe this week, that are for land application, right? And so this is specifically for discharge onto land for effectively for native grasses and those types of things. The permits for discharge are on their way through, and I think we would like to hope that these permits will move very quickly because we know the science is there. There is a criticism by
And is this for testing, or is this like
for purpose.
full steam ahead? Just
We've done the
charging?
pilots. The pilots have proven, the irony is the pilots, well, the one things the pilots did tell us is how much we couldn't put potable water on native grasses.
Okay.
They basically died. It's too clean. You
That's
have to
amazing to
add
think that.
TDS to it, some salinity to it in order to make it we're in a desert in West Texas.
Right,
It's
sure.
it's a Chihuahuan, and so the native water or the salinity in the groundwater is a high concentration, right? That's just the way it is, and so the specs show that they need to test up. I think it's 3,000 in TDS is your typical groundwater, highest quality groundwater in the state. That's kind of that number at the commission. But basically, we're talking 7-10,000 is probably the most appropriate. But I'll leave that to the land application experts. But long story short, we know we can treat it. We know that the real thing we need is to move the permits more quickly, and we need markets, right? I mean, at the very least, if you don't think, which I think the science proves you wrong, but if you don't think it is a safe aspect to use this water in maybe human engaging situations, at the very least, it needs to be the offset for fresh water. We need to be using it in
Right.
cementing. We need to be using it in maybe as a feedstock for power generation. And we're lucky. We have great leadership in this space from the governor, lieutenant governor, certainly Senator Perry and Senator Sparks, but also in the House, Chairman Landgraf chairs the committee that oversees TCEQ, and he visited with our water committee just last week to talk about these issues. We are lucky that with Speaker from Lubbock. I mean, there's no
Sure.
question. Now is the time that the iron is hot. We have to strike. And frankly, this is an existential issue. We're seeing breakouts and seismic events occur because of saltwater disposal. We all know that. That's the intellectually honest thing. We know that's true. What we also know that we need to do is find markets for this water because it is untenable to continue to dispose of it in this manner. And just from a space perspective, right? So here's a great example of the constraint to growth. A year and a half ago, we were producing 5.5 million barrels in the Permian, a large amount of oil and gas, right? But 5.5 million barrels of crude oil every day from the Permian. Right now, between Texas and New Mexico, we're producing about 6.7 million barrels a day. So it's a
Wow.
year over year, a million barrel growth. Also, if you
And
would have
most
told people
likely will
that
continue to
to grow,
increase.
exactly, yeah. Even and to your point previously, volatility is not our friend. I think we are seeing that play
Yes.
out. Operators are looking at this with a lot of risk, and they're very concerned about what this means. And I think unfortunately, I'll jump back to the water in a second, but
Okay.
we had pricing at $55 for a year.
Yep.
We had layoffs. We had people let go of career professionals. That's hard
Clearly.
on an industry.
Yep.
There's not exactly a lot of interest in bringing people in just to lay them off in 6 months if prices fall again. I mean, that's an unfortunate circumstance that no one wants to, and that's not just the publicly traded, right? Independents feel this, if anything, more
Oh,
tightly than anyone else. And so
clearly.
that's hard, right? And so from that perspective, that compressed pricing for the last year has certainly inhibited our ability to grow. We're probably seeing a lot of the ducks come online right now. So these drilled and uncompleted wells are probably the first batch. We probably have the lowest inventory that we've had in 10 years, 2014 probably. And so as we look at that, those are constraints, monetary constraints to growth. This is a physical constraint. If you can't move your water, if you can't move your gas, and you can't move your crude all at the same time, those are going to be physically limiting factors. And I think a lot of our members have been voicing this alarm for years that the water issue is the thing that keeps them up at night.
Well, let me put you in an awkward spot because I know being part of PBPA, you're representing these operators, but it becomes an economic issue and the reason people keep disposing of water, it's cheaper
It is.
than. So does that require a regulatory or government action to force that? Because yes, it'd be great to say, oil and gas companies, you need to do the right thing, but their job is to make money and not to be the moral high ground.
Sure.
So how should that be balanced within the whole regulatory world versus operating world?
It's kind of the greatest irony. I think we've been told that we don't trust the science enough. We don't believe in the science enough. And it's ironic because this is a very science-based industry, right? I
Sure.
mean, I
Should
I
be.
can't think of a more technical or science-based industry than the one we work in. But with that said, one of the challenges has been environmental NGOs thinking this will continue to pervade the growth of oil and gas, and so they oppose it. They want to keep it in the ground. That's fair. That's a perspective. It's not true, but it's a perspective. I'll lend them that. But the other part of this is though that the market can't move because the permits haven't moved yet either, right? So there's some regulatory constraint that exists, and then in every public policy conversation, it always comes down to the very basic foundation of, in order to move actors to a location or to a purpose, there's either a carrot or a stick, right? I can't tell you which one of those would be more effective or not. I can tell you that industry is moving with no capital gain in treating produced water right now, very quickly, very expensively. I mean, if you look at all of these operators, and you've seen it firsthand, right? I mean, while E&P has become more of a manufacturing perspective, and while they're still
Right.
certainly, I don't want to tell the guys that are putting charges in that they're not innovative. They still are. But if you look at other parts of the industry, the most dynamic sector has clearly been the water space. You have companies coming into this space, investing a
Clearly.
ton of money with no return guaranteed, and that's a huge reality for them. So I think the short answer is industry's moving to this area. Unfortunately, I think regulators, markets are slower than we are, and unfortunately in like the electricity space, we solve that issue ourselves by maybe creating more long-term problem by self-gen.
Right.
In this case, we can't without permits, we can't without public trust. We're trying to do this as quickly as possible, recognizing those are serious limitations.
Help me understand how New Mexico is looking at some of these issues versus, and the water issue versus how we are, because it seems like they have a very different viewpoint on that. Is
Yeah.
that something we can learn from, either on the
Yes.
positive or the negative?
I think it's funny. New Mexico is a challenging state to operate in, right? It's become more expensive, more regulatory
I've heard
difficult.
that.
Yeah, and ironically, one of the challenges is because it's less landowners. It is actually because it's state and federal lands you're dealing with, and that creates all sorts of headaches, whether it's leasing or right of way or moving water, or all these requirements that you have. So those are real limitations. Ironically, though, New Mexico was far more aggressive and forward thinking than Texas was on produced water. Their New Mexico water consortium, produced water consortium, is older than ours by several years, and they were very good about thinking about this. And then the slowdown happened,
Yep.
and I think that's what I think we can learn from. You can't. There's there's inherent analysis paralysis when it comes to big ideas, and I don't think. I think we do intend. This is a Norman Mailer quote, but I do think we do shrink from the immensity of the purpose that we're here for at times, and this is one of those places that I think that has happened. And unfortunately, New Mexico has stalled, despite great work by efforts, whether it's the Water Alliance or others, to move the petition for rulemaking for water, for beneficial reuse. Unfortunately, I think the NGOs and others that have lent criticisms have gained credibility where I don't think they should, versus in Texas where I think we're all trying to move forward. It's just slower. But I think the short answer is we can't afford to fail. This is an existential issue for the industry, and it's one that we have to solve. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I mean, I would approach this like more intensely or more intently than I think we did approach air in like 2019. This
Well,
is a big one.
and I think where air was and methane was so focused in the previous years, I kind of see and I'll let you respond on this, but almost people are tired of that. They're done with that. But I think what we're about to see is produced water, zombie wells, all that produced water contaminating fresh water. There's all those issues
Yeah.
that I think in the next, well, we're already seeing it, but I think that's our next big hotbed.
And I think if you look at it from the lens of pressurization in the region, the water part addresses a lot of those, right? So like
Yes.
whenever we
Oh,
look at
it's directly
blowouts or
related to it.
seismic, these are like symptoms to the broader issue, right?
Yes.
And so it's again, I use a euphemism, right? It's a very folksy way of just the way we are, I guess, here. But you can pay for an ounce of prevention or a pound of cure. We've gotten to the point where we're past the pound part, right? We need a lot of big efforts to address these issues, and I think to speak to a real concern, I think there's no question we have an inactive well issue, we have an orphaned well issue in this state, and I think we know that. I think everyone knows that. And I think if we're not paying attention to those issues, those are going to be the issues that I think we will be criticized for roundly and appropriately.
Well, if you believe in our license to operate, that is one of the most obvious slaps against us.
Yeah,
by
the public
not
should trust.
maintaining
Yeah.
the downhole integrity and taking care of inactive and orphan wells.
And I think part of this challenge too is legacy production in the state is so historic, right? I mean, we've been operating in the state for 100 years in the Permian alone, and so that doesn't include the East Texas, great prolific production there during pre-war and post-war. But there's no question the integrity of the industry is at stake, and the credibility among the public is, if we can't solve this issue, really going to be threatened, and frankly, rightfully so. I do commend the commission for all the work they've done to plug wells, but I think as I talk to legislators and the public and our members, what more can we do? How do we do more? And I think part of this problem is we have a regulatory structure that never intended. So here's a good kind of a parallel challenge, right? So historically in the industry, we've been told, and I mean literally in the industry, if you've got an asset, you can't just discard that asset, right? You've created a stranded cost and a stranded asset. You don't do that. You want to maintain that well for perpetuity because
Sure.
that is an investment you've made. That is a sunk cost.
And it's got upside potential. You hear all those same things.
Except now here, because since 2009, the world changed on its head. We saw, I think, conventional production in the Permian in 2005 was like 80-20 or 90-10 in favor of conventional, and now it's the opposite. It's 90-10 in unconventional.
Yep.
If anything, conventional is unconventional, right? In the Permian, everyone is operating unconventional. And so in that space, in that world, I think one thing we probably need to admit is that these wells that have existed prior are no longer going to be economic in this new world. Now, how do you address the fact that there are companies that have taken in fact large inventories of inactive of inactive wells or marginal wells that hope to seek to maintain them, and also we don't want to shut off the ability for people to have entry into the industry, right? There's still room for investment with marginal production and probably some inactive wells, but we also have to find where that balance is because we've tried to with Senate bill last session to look at inactive wells and to force plugging and limit extensions of plugging.
You're talking about where after 15 years they have to do something with
Yeah,
it.
any well that's 25 years old after 15 years of activity, that's the pincer point. You've got to plug the well basically, and I think that.
Now, I've heard there's pushback on that might change. Is that?
I would probably argue the pushback is that it needs to probably be more strict. I think
Okay.
people
Well,
are I think this is the hard
there's a
part.
hot sports opinion.
Yeah, this is the hard part, right? Is that balance? Where should it exist? Now, granted, if you're an operator that's taken in this inventory and you have a history of proving that you can produce inactive wells into activity or marginal wells to greater activity, that's a good case that I think you should be able to make of why your operations prove that. We've seen that in the Barnett area pretty well. We've seen it in East Texas and in the Gulf Coast. Like there's certainly those places those people are doing that for. And and the last thing I think we want to do is limit opportunities that are economic for people if they can prove them up.
But the flip side of that is if a well has been inactive that long, the integrity of that cement, of that annulus, of that pipe, is that a viable well to recomplete? And if you're talking science, that's probably not the case,
I
unfortunately.
think you're right. And here's the worst part. Like I made this comment to somebody, engineers can engineer anything. So yes, if you have unlimited capital, you can return that
You
to
bet.
economic activity. Absolutely. There's no
But
one
that
more
little tricky word
intelligent.
of rate of return or
Yes, it is.
internal.
And so that's the question is, yes, you can recase Swiss cheese casing all you want. Do you want to? And then at what point does it become someone else's problem? And I think for the state of Texas, the question is when does it become the state of Texas's problem? And the answer is it should never be the state of Texas's problem. So the question has to be, how do we encourage plugging without, negatively impacting operators that have built a position that is based on leveraging inactive wells or marginal wells? And I think during the hearing last year, I was said, look, the committee, they were kind of debating each other about how to make sure this bill would work, and senators who are very smart were talking about it, and I kind of had to say, you're looking at this now like we are. We're trying to make sure we solve the problem without creating another one, without negatively impacting investment, recognizing, with all due respect to large operators, the Permian did not resurrect in 2007, 8, 9 because of large industrial, major multinational corporations. It was the people that had been there the whole time that had never left, right?
Right.
Whether it was Sheffield and Pioneer or whether it was Concho or Diamondback or all these companies that were there investing, and of course the independents, guys like Discovery, guys like BTA and Henry and Fasken, like these companies were there, they never left. And so we don't want to create a world where the industry is so monolithic that it doesn't allow room for independent thought or investment. Because if that was the case, we'd never have had fracturing in the scale we have today. It was always too risky. It was too unfounded, right? And I remember talking, this is a separate story, but I remember talking to a friend of mine who now works in Houston for an operator who went to college together with my best friends. And there was a story in the Permian Basin Oil and Gas magazine about a well pad plan that had failed. And this was probably 2012 or 13, maybe 15. And it was about spacing. We were all trying to figure out appropriate spacing at the time. And I said, man, I really hate this. I gave him the magazine and said, I really hate that this happened and that it failed. He's like, no. He's like, this is great. You don't learn anything from success. You have to fail. Like that's how you learn spacing. And it was just a great reminder of failure is a much better teacher than success. And independents are often more willing to fail than large companies, and we need that investment. And so, to that point, the inactive oil issue is going to be one that we're going to be heavily engaged in. Our members have large inventories or large percentages potentially, right? We want to solve this in the best way, but also make sure that it's not an albatross hanging around our neck that becomes a problem and certainly loses us that
It
public
is
trust.
amazing. Depending on what you do on the inactive wells, the orphan wells, well, inactive wells, the state might end up with a whole lot more orphan wells, and so be careful what you ask
That's
for.
right.
So it does fit. We're running out of time,
Sure.
so I really want to focus on one more topic: the oilfield theft.
Sure. Yeah.
That the Senator Sparks, others created this. I think you're on the committee.
Yeah. And the task
Chairman
force.
Wright
Yeah.
is chairing the task force. Tell us what it's amazing when you think of it. I always thought it was just people stealing fittings and some pipe here, copper there, but it is almost like a cartel-based effort with oil and much larger.
Yeah.
But where do we stand on changes on the task force, the
You know,
issues associated with that?
I've really got to commend the West Texas delegation of folks. They really understood and they heard it from everyone. I mean, we first started talking about this at our board meeting in probably 2022. And it's kind of funny. It's like a brush fire, right? One member says something in a committee in our board meeting, and then someone has, oh, that happened to me too. Or,
Yep.
oh, did you hear about this? And it just goes around the room and you're realizing, oh, this is a much bigger issue than we thought, because I think a lot of us thought this is about metals, this is about pipe, it's about stranded.
$5 here, $10 there.
And unfortunately, for better or worse, for better or worse, theft has existed as long as petroleum has existed, right? I mean, what Spindletop I think was completed on some borrowed pipe, and so I think that's there's some truth to that being a long time issue. But you're right, the sophistication here has been completely misunderstood, I think, by all of us. And so unfortunately, when we looked at this, we found that it was far more complicated, far more aggressive, and certainly, you have, for example. But let me go back to real quick and just say this: the legislative effort with Senator Sparks, who's now chairing Natural Resources, who's going to be a great asset for this
Clearly.
industry. But also, we had Representatives Craddock and Darby and Landgraf, and it was a collective effort. 3 bills. One allowed statewide jurisdiction for the Department of Public Safety to investigate. That's had a huge effort in really interdicting this at a criminal level. But one of the challenges is, we've seen, if you look at it, one operator it was February of 2025 during the session. We're about to testify for these bills the week before. This truck comes on, tries to through one of the pig lines connect to the tank, and explodes. And so you've got 3 tanks on fire, 2 trucks on fire, 2 miles of pipe having to burn. Right before we're about to testify about why oilfield theft's a problem in the legislature, and they made the case for us. And they found these were 3 Cuban nationals. They found 2 in a burn unit. Somehow they survived. I mean, truly, somehow they survived. It was a cold night. There was static in the air, high pressure line. I mean, they're lucky they were not in pieces. And the 3rd they found in Florida. And so this has been a crazy collective, collaborative issue. Chairman Jim Wright's done a great job at organizing this task force. The commission staff has done a great job of bringing together security personnel that work for operators, oil and gas operators, to the trades, and of course, some of the members of the public. This is such a big issue that we're still trying to grab our hands around. But I think the one thing we do know is that we still need additional resources for this. And I chaired our subcommittee for recommendations. We're going to have a conversation at the Railroad Commission Regulatory Conference in July and talk about some of the suggestions we're proposing for the legislature. But one of them is going to be how to better prosecute these crimes. One of the things that's missing is the expertise and the ability to adequately take great investigative work by operators and law enforcement and put these people in jail. And we appreciate the work being done by the FBI Dallas office and El Paso office. We want them to continue to work more collaboratively. And also, we know that our local DAs need help. But truly, I can't, compliment Captain Murphy with the Department of Public Safety, who chairs the DPS task force, and his guys have been running around all over West Texas, scoring great results and delivering security for our membership.
Any other insight, though, as to what can be done? You talk investigation and prosecution, but it's such a challenge because it's spread all over thousands of acres, but is there, or are y'all still in the process of figuring out recommendations?
We are, and I think one of these resources is training local law enforcement to know what they're seeing, right? I think
Right.
so the DPS, in collaboration with the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, has developed a training for West Texas law enforcement
Okay.
to allow city PDs, sheriff's offices, to help cover. But you're right. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is in an area the size that's bigger than Minnesota. We have all of this disjointed law enforcement groups, and county lines do beget issues.
Yep.
But the best thing about Senate Bill 1806 that Senator Sparks carried with creating statewide jurisdiction for DPS helps, allow DPS to come in, help help the investigation, which then leads to, I think, effective prosecution. So one of the things we do know is our members need to report these things in greater volume. Unfortunately, one of the challenges to reporting has been the history of, well, we've reported it, no one ever does anything, why does anyone care? And so we're trying to talk about how important it is to maintain credibility. Reporting theft has had no credibility among operators for the last decade, and so we're
Yep.
trying to rebuild that. And it's hard to rebuild trust, like we talked about earlier. You build credibility and trust and and respect in droplets, but you will lose it in buckets. And I think in this case, we have not a drop to spare in trying to make sure the industry knows we are working really hard on this. And I appreciate you bringing it up, because if members can understand and reach out to us, and we can help you figure out who you need to talk to report this, to make sure it gets investigated. PBPA came out with the first of its kind best practices for security measures a couple years ago, and that includes both physical and cyber security issues. We worked really closely with a security consultant to address this, and I'll tell you, we want to be a collaborative industry. We want to be a collaborative association, and like we said, the things we talk about are less about E&P drilling and completion. It's everything else.
Yeah, all the drilling and the rock is very controllable. It's all
Yeah.
these other things that are not. Michael, thank you so much for
Grant,
being
thanks for
here.
having me.
It's I think you just saw an example where the value that Permian Basin Petroleum Association and the people that work for them can really help the industry and add to the industry. There's so many issues that aren't controllable that are needed to be approached at the government level. Well, you need people like Michael and the Permian Basin Petroleum Association to be able to address those and bring those to the forefront. Similarly, I think the Permian Basin Oil and Gas magazine, with the in-depth research they do and the articles they do, they really highlight some of these issues in such a way that it really brings it to the forefront, and people can act on. So hopefully you enjoyed this. It's kind of had some negatives and some challenges on it, but we've got to make you aware of it so that there could be actions going forward. If you like what you heard on the Oilfield Strong episode today, please share it with other people and let them know about our YouTube and all the social media platform that we share with everyone. Thank you very much.